Since inflation is so easy to explain, it's just a matter of how much money supply is out there. Again, as money supply grows, more money and inflation, looks kind of like that. Countries with high money supply growth have high inflation rates. Countries with low money supply growth have low inflation rates. It's pretty easy. So, and it's not that difficult to manage the money supply. Okay, you can't manage it to the dime for sure, or for periods that are necessarily short term, but month to month, or at least quarter to quarter for sure, you can manage pretty well manage the money supply. So, why do countries have inflation? It's a choice. Why do they choose it? Well, that's an interesting question. Now, as you recall, GDP is equal to consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus spending on exports netted out against imports, net exports. So, G, where does government get its money to spend? Well, they can tax it. They can borrow it. And we've talked about that when we talked about the financial system, taxing it. And then if they spend more than they tax in as revenue, they borrow the difference. And that is where our deficits come from. And each year's deficit from year to year to year adds up, and that's the total debt. But they can also print. They can just print it up. Print the money. Well, this actually is a decent way to do things if taxes are difficult to collect. All right, say you're kind of a backwoods country, and you don't have a system all set up for this sort of thing. It might be easier for the government, rather than send people out and try to collect the taxes out there in the hills with everybody with their shotguns, right? Just print it up instead. Or if there are weak financial markets, again, a young, immature country or a developing country where it's difficult to borrow, it's difficult to tax, okay? Well, that pretty well describes the United States back in the 1770s. In fact, the U.S. financed, the Continental Congress financed the Revolutionary War primarily through just printing up money. And they had inflation to go right along there with it. Well, when governments pay for goods and services by printing money, they are effectively levying what we call an inflation tax. Like the U.S., when they paid for, the Continental Congress paid for the Revolutionary War by printing money, and inflation rose right up along with it. We call that differences in prices as a result of the printing of the money an inflation tax. Here's how that would work. Okay, let's say something costs $10 and you enact a 10% tax. So $10, and then you get a 10% tax on that, And that would mean out of pocket, you'd spend $11, right? $10 for the good, $1 tax. That's how that would work. That's just a regular tax system. Or, let's say the $10, no tax system, nothing, but the government is printing money. They're using an inflation tax. Well, because they're printing up money, let's say the price goes up to $10 or to $11. Well, instead of levying a $1 tax like they did here, they levied effectively a $1 inflation tax because the price went up from 10 to 11. Either way, you're shelling out $11, right? Whether it's $10 and then a $1 tax, or just the price goes up $1 because of inflation, you're handing over $11 either way. So that's an alternative way to do it, is have an inflation tax. So if it doesn't really matter where you pay 11 here or 11 here, why not just use an inflation tax? Look at all the costs you could avoid by having the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, the whole tax system, and having to do your tax returns. And as your returns get more complicated, you have to go to a tax preparer, or at least most people choose to, or an accountant or something, None of that would be necessary. Just use the inflation tax. Well, there are problems. There are costs to inflation. And costs that move us inside the production possibilities curve. Okay, here we are on the production possibilities curve, but for reasons we're going to talk about right now, inflation can move us inside the production possibilities curve. And that results in inefficiency and a lower standard of living. So inflation has cost involved. That's why we don't like it. Now, one of the misconceptions about inflation is that there's a loss in purchasing power. Well, there isn't, okay? Not in the long run. Remember, we're talking about the long run. So, let's go back to our circular flow model. Right? So, households spend their money and in return get goods and services. Now, recall that this spending flows through as income. So as inflation gets higher and higher, this spending goes up and up because inflation's higher and higher, right? All that flows through as income. So this rises, this rises. So one of the costs of inflation over the long haul is not a loss in purchasing power. However, in shorter periods than, say, the long run, where everything evens out nicely, in the short run, it can actually result in a redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich. And that is a very undesirable characteristic. You can debate all day how much income redistribution there should be. Some will argue we need a solid safety net, but that's it. Others will argue, well, we need a little more income because inequality is bad. They'll argue that. Okay, but at the heart of each of those arguments is that redistribution of income, if it takes place at all, or to what extent it takes place, will be from the rich to the poor. What inflation tends to do in the short term is redistribute from the poor to the rich. For example, homeowners. Homeowners will typically have a fixed payment for their mortgage, and if there's inflation, their incomes rise with inflation, but their home payments, their house payments stay the same, and their value of the home rises. So they've got this asset that they're living in, and it's rising in price, it's rising in value. Their house payment stays fixed, and their incomes are going up. Hey, what's the problem here? Inflation is pretty good. Contrast that to lower income people who rent. Do their rent stay fixed? No, they go up. Okay. So there is essentially a redistribution from renters to homeowners, if you want to look at it that way. Not directly necessary, but that's the outcome. So we're not during periods of inflation. People who own assets tend to do very well. People who don't do so well. So those are more short-term outcomes. Long-term, again, spending equals income. As and those are going to even out over the long haul. Overall, but there can be some redistribution in the way this income shakes out. Okay, the first problem with inflation. Now keep in mind the common denominator here with most of these, I think all of them, is that they go inside. It puts us inside the production possibilities curve. So the first one, shoe leather costs. Let's look at a traditional tax system. We're not talking inflation tax here, just to compare and contrast. With our tax system as we have it, and especially as taxes get higher and higher, people will have an incentive to spend time researching ways to lower their taxes. They'll spend time researching tax-sheltered investments, and they'll search for loopholes in the tax code. And the time and resources spent, loophole mining, that's what they call that, loophole mining, is a cost on our income tax system. Because instead of being productive and producing goods and services, they're just using their time, and to be innovative, they're just using their time to figure out ways to get their taxes down. Well, again, time that could have gone to productive purposes aren't, and thus that can move us inside the production possibilities curve. Well, the same is true with the inflation tax. With an inflation tax, people who hold money are hurt by inflation. People who hold their assets in money. So what's the incentive during high inflation? Hold as few assets as possible in the form of money. You're going to, let's say, bonds. You're going to hold your money in bonds instead, and other assets, but let's just say bonds. So, all but what is necessary to spend or go to the store, you're going to keep in bonds. So you're going to be liquidating it periodically. You're going to have to go and liquidate these bonds to give you just the money you need to go spend at the store, because you can't take the bond to the store and spend it. You're going to have to liquidate it first. And all that time and effort and of managing, just dealing with inflation, is what we call shoe leather costs. Now the name gets its name from because you're going to have to go to the bank all those times to liquidate bonds and get cash. You're going to wear out your shoes. Okay, that's where the name shoe leather costs come from. You're going to wear out your shoes, go to the bank all those times. So again, that's just the time and inconvenience of dealing and managing inflation in such a way. Now, a great example of shoe leather costs was during the German hyperinflation. They had 1,000% inflation per month, and just how did they manage that? Well, they were paid every day and given time off so they could go and buy things every day before the prices went up some more. And that's very costly. That time and effort could have been again spent producing instead of just managing or dealing with the inflationary problems. In such a case, the money's function as a store of value is destroyed, has no store of value during a high inflation. Well, the next one is menu costs. Think of this. This is the same kind of thing except for the side of the business. During high periods of inflation, you're going to have to constantly be printing out new price lists, putting together new catalogs, that sort of thing, and that is very costly. Now with the internet, it's not as bad as it used to be because it's easier to update a catalog online and change prices online. It's still a lot of work to do, but it's not as costly where you actually have to print out price lists and catalogs. Okay, the third reason is it distorts relative prices. Prices relative to each other. We make our purchasing decisions based on what the price of one good is relative to the price of another good. Now, in the case of, let's say, printing up new menus, let's say inflation is 12% per year, and you've decided that you can only afford to print up one menu each year. So you print up one that kind of gives an average price. So you're going to start out, the menu, at first the prices are going to be relatively low. And then as the year goes by, they grow at 1% per month. And at the end of the year, they're going to be relatively high. So the menu is never going to, relative price-wise, it's never going to be very accurate. There's going to be some inefficiencies there because it will not accurately reflect relative prices one good to the other. Consumer decisions will be distorted and resources are not allocated efficiently. Tax distortions, another problem. And this actually not only gets us inside the production possibilities curve, but can really shift the curve in because it's going to result in really reduced investment, capital investment. Well, let's say you buy a stock at $50 and you sell at $100. You would have what is called a capital gain of $50, right? You bought it 50, sold it at 100. And you're going to pay taxes on that $50 gain. Well, let's say the CPI is 100 when you buy the stock at 50, and it's 200 when you sell the stock at 100. Did you make any money? Well, yeah, you made money. Did you make any purchasing power? No. Your stock doubled in price from 50 to 100, but prices overall doubled as well. So you had no gain in purchasing power. But you're still going to pay tax on that $50. You didn't gain a thing. Now, if that's going on, how much saving are you going to do? Are you going to be motivated to go out and buy stock? You're going to go be motivated to go out and try to invest and, well, I should say save. We save, and so firms will have money to invest in new capital and replace worn-out machinery in factories? No, you're not going to be doing this again. Okay? You're going to go out and spend that money before you lose the purchasing power. During high inflation, the incentive is to spend, not to save. So with all that spending and no saving, there's no financing for new capital or the replacement of worn-out capital. And what does that do? Well, that is definitely going to move. That's going to be an actual shift of the production possibilities because we're losing capital stock and our standard of living falls. So what's the solution to that? Well, first of all, the best solution is don't have inflation. Manage your money supply such that there's no inflation. Or index your taxes. Now, the Milton Friedman video we saw, that was before taxes were indexed to inflation. And boy, people were outraged at that time that inflation, income increases just due to inflation, cost of living increases, were pushing them into higher tax brackets. And of course, people became outraged enough that they actually started indexing them. But that video was made before they did that. So you can index taxes, and they are indexed today. Also, other benefits are indexed to inflation. Social Security benefits are indexed to inflation. There's a cost of living increase based on the Consumer Price Index each year. And if there's inflation, I don't think there was one this past year, actually. So that's one way to deal with that, is to have tax brackets that are indexed to inflation. That's what we do. But again, a better solution is just not have inflation in the first place. The fifth one is it disrupts money's role as a unit of account. Unit of account. Remember, that's the scorekeeping device money provides. And it results in confusion and less efficient financial markets. Okay. Let's say there's high inflation, and you're looking for a company to invest in. And typically, as part of your research, you would be looking at financial statements. And companies usually publish financial statements every quarter. Well, during high inflation, how accurate are those financial statements, say, 2 months from the time they were printed? everything could be very different then. Those numbers from 2 months ago don't mean nearly as much in times of high inflation. So it's going to make it harder to evaluate and to compare one company to another when the monies roll as a unit of account is disrupted. You can't really count on those numbers. That's going to make you less likely to do that research, which means it's going to be less. You're going to be less likely to invest, which again shifts that production possibilities curve to the left as the capital stock dries up, is not replaced, because firms aren't going to have the financing, the funds available from savers to finance those investments. Okay, 6. Or that was 6. Wait, that's 5, 6. Did I skip one? Time out here. No, I didn't. Okay, 6. Unexpected. Okay, unexpected. This is a word we're going to have to get to know as we, for the rest of the course, actually, we're going to be talking about expected versus unexpected things, because that shifts things around. Unexpected inflation. Can redistribute wealth. I should say arbitrarily. From lenders to borrowers, or from borrowers to lenders. Okay, well, to illustrate how this works, we're going to have the nominal rate here. Remember, that's the rate at which we do business. That's the rate of the contract. That's the interest rates that are published, okay? And expected inflation here. And we'll put, let's change the color, actual inflation here. And the expected real rate here, and the actual real rate here. Okay, decisions are made based on what we expect. We don't know the future, so we, expect. Here's let's say the real rate is, the expected real rate is 3%. Whoops. And inflation is expected to be 5%. Well, if you require a 3% real rate and you expect inflation to be 5, so the nominal rate's going to be 8. Right? So we go back the other way. 8 minus 5% equals a 3% real rate. Well, let's say inflation is higher than expected. Actual inflation is, let's just say it's 10%. Everybody thought it was going to be 5, so everybody was cool with the 8% rate here. Everybody's fine with this because everybody thought inflation was going to be 5. Leaving everybody with a real rate of 3%. Everybody's fine. But inflation wasn't 5%, it was 10%. So the nominal rate is 8. Inflation turned out to be 10. So what's the actual real rate? Well, it's 8 minus 10. It's minus 2%. It's actually a negative rate. So the money was lent out at 8. Inflation was 10. The actual rate, real rate, is 2. Negative 2. So who's happy and who's upset? Well, the lender is not happy because they're, instead of getting a real rate of 3%, they're getting a real rate of negative 2. They're actually worse off for making the loan. The borrower is very happy with this arrangement because they expected to pay interest of a real rate of 3. They're actually paying a negative real rate. So the way that works, again, is that the loan interest is calculated at 8%, but their cost of living, because of inflation, their cost of living, remember, their income is going to be going up. So fixed payments, income's going up. Hey, if you were a borrower, you love it when inflation ends up being higher than expected. So unexpectedly high inflation, let me write that out. Unexpected inflation redistributes from lender to borrower. Redistributes wealth from the lender to the borrower. The borrower was better off because inflation was unexpectedly high. Well, I should say unexpected high inflation, okay? It was higher than expected. Okay, let's go the other direction now. Let's say, here we are, same as before, 8% nominal rate. Everybody expects inflation to be 5, so everybody expects a real rate of 3. Everybody's good with that. The contract's signed. Borrower and lender, both happy, both fine with that. But then inflation turns out to be 2%. It turns out to be lower than expected. So now what's the real rate? What does it end up being? You thought it was going to be 3. Now it's going to be 8 minus 2. %. Well, who's happy and who's sad now? Well, the lender expected to be getting a 3% real return. They're getting 6% because inflation turned out to be lower than they thought. Since it was lower than they thought, actually this nominal rate was set higher than they, really needed to set it. But they're not complaining. The borrower, expecting to pay 3, is actually paying 6. And what's happening here is they expected income, cost of living increases at the rate of 5%. They're only going to get a 2, and so they're taking it hard. They're paying a higher real rate. So if inflation is lower than expected, wealth is redistributed from the borrower to the lender. Now, this isn't much of a problem when inflation rates are very low. When rates are very low, it tends to be more stable. So you're not going to have these wide swings in actual versus expected inflation, and these wide differences between the expected real rate and the actual real rate. But at high rates of inflation, inflation gets to be volatile and hard to predict, and actual versus expected can take place quite a bit. So that really messes up, again, financial markets and makes them less efficient, more difficult for that savings to investment component. That's all too important, as we learned when we talked about the financial system. And speaking of inflation being lower than expected and how wealth is redistributed from the borrower to the lender, a true life situation happened in 1880 to 1896. There was a deflation. Now, deflation is when prices are falling. Just the opposite of inflation. So prices fell from 1880 to 1896. Prices fell. So, well, what we know about inflation, we know inflation rises when the money supply grows too fast. What would cause prices to fall? Just the opposite. If the money supply is falling, prices will also fall. Now, back then, we were on the gold standard, and money was backed by gold, and only money could be issued if there was gold to back it. And so we, at that time, the economy was growing faster, wanted to grow faster than the money supply could grow. In fact, it actually fell. That's why there was deflation. Why was the money supply falling? Because gold miners were on a cold streak. There just wasn't any gold being mined, or not enough. Okay, so money backed by gold was falling. So because the gold miners weren't mining enough gold and prices were falling, the proposal was to use silver as to back the money supply. And there's a big debate called the free silver debate. But let's take a look at how this worked before we get further into that. Let's just say the 6% nominal rate and expected inflation is 4%. So 6 minus 4, and there's a 2% real rate. That's what would happen. Now, if you went into a long-term contract or a loan agreement under this situation, and then it turns out that there's a deflation, let's just say it went the other way, in 6, and let's say that the prices fell by 4, so we would subtract a negative 4. So instead of inflation of 4 over here, we have deflation of 4. So what's the real rate now? 10%. So you're paying, instead of 2, you're paying 10. So with a deflation, you're really getting killed if you're a borrower. Now, who borrows a lot of money? Farmers. Farmers live on credit. They borrow money to buy equipment, tractors, and so forth, and supplies, seeds, and whatnot to get back in the fall. But here's the problem. Their payments are staying constant at the nominal rate, interest calculated by the nominal rate, while the price of the good they're producing is falling. So their money that they pay out in their debt payments, debt servicing, is constant. Their income keeps going down. Now, during this time of deflation, actually prices fell 23%. Okay, so this was devastating, especially to farmers. And keep in mind, back in 1880 to 1896, most everybody were farmers. Okay, so it was killing everybody. This deflation was killing everybody. They just couldn't handle it. And so there was this debate about free silver. And let's use silver to be part of the money supply. And if you use silver and gold, then the money supply could rise, and then we'd get rid of this deflation. Well, they never did implement the free silver because I think gold was discovered. I can't remember where offhand. I think it was Australia. But somewhere gold was discovered somewhere, then the gold supply rose, and therefore the money supply rose, and this deflation went away. So gold miners to the rescue, the money supply increased. Now, if you're wondering why we're no longer on the gold standard, that is precisely why. You don't want to have a money supply hamstrung by the availability of whatever resource it's tied to. So another interesting sidelight on this, the free silver debate. This is hotly debated whether silver should be used to back the money supply. The Wizard of Oz actually was written in that environment, and that is about the free silver debate, a lot of it. Now, look at the Yellow Brick Road, the gold standard, okay? And I think the Cowardly Lion was, I forgot the name of the president at the time. I don't have it in front of me, but whoever was the president of the United States was the Cowardly Lion, and each character had a role in this, was somebody. And I think it says that in the text, in the back of the chapter, you can read about this. But the silver slippers, Dorothy's silver slippers, was to fix it everything. The free silver, was Dorothy's silver slippers. Now, much is lost in the movie version of Baum's book. And they changed the slippers to ruby. But in the book, it's silver. But anyway, yeah, little did you know, Wizard of Oz, about the 19th century debate of monetary policy. Okay, so, the Wicked Witch was somebody. I'm sorry, I shouldn't even brought it up because I can't remember. But anyway, there is a little blurb about that in the text. So each character was somebody involved in this debate.